From the newsroom, it's back to you.
Thanks very much, Danica. Well, joining me now is Senator Fierravanti-Wells from New South Wales from the Liberal Party. Senator, thanks very much for joining us tonight on this busy Sunday night. I've seen a few reports on what you've said in Parliament in regards to the Twitter outrage and sleeping giants. What responsibilities do you think that social media platforms have to stop the abuse of individuals and companies, which we've seen so frequently going on?
Well, thanks, Adam, and thanks very much for having me on your show. Look, that's a very, very good question. I think making social media companies verify the identification of their users would certainly moderate the debate a lot on Twitter, but also I think result in a greater degree of transparency. This is really the key issue now that I think that we're going to have to grapple with in this whole situation where we're seeing enormous numbers of anonymous accounts trolling out there and effectively just giving out fake news.
Well, it's not just trolling, it's attacking companies, it's changing the landscape of the corporate approach in Australia, but it's also trolling and attacking individuals, and we've seen the tragedies that occur, particularly amongst young people, with mental health illness, anxiety, depression and suicide, and we've heard about some well-known cases of suicide in Australia. Is there a role for government to step in and regulate, not regulating the internet, but is there a role for government to step in to protect companies and to protect individuals?
Look, I think there is a role here, and I think that notwithstanding the fact that a lot of these companies are overseas and certainly particularly with the accounts that are anonymous, it is difficult to regulate. But nevertheless, I think that particularly when we're dealing with vulnerable, particularly when we're dealing with young people, I think that that's certainly a role that governments have a role to play. And we've seen that with the work that's being done by the E-Safety Commission. I think that's been a very, very good institution that has been established by the Coalition. And certainly the work that they've done has been very, very good. And we saw some additional funding given to the E-Safety Commissioner at the last budget. But it was also good to see today the New South Wales Government announcement in relation to what it's now going to do, particularly with the extension of the definitions of intimidation to text messaging and also to online users. So I think that that's going to be really good, and it's really good that Gladys Berejiklian has taken this initiative here in New South Wales.
Well, I haven't seen that initiative announced today, but I think it's really important that you protect those young people who are just copping a flogging on social media all the time. It's terrible. Of course, the corporations need to stand up and do a lot more, and what Angelo did in calling it out for what it was in terms of political thuggery, I think is the right thing. Now, can I move on to federal politics? Of course, you were one of the first ministers to resign the Turnbull ministry in support of a leadership change. We'll just see on the screen now what is the most recent news poll. On reflection, was the right decision made, and do you have any regrets over that, having seen some of the commentary that's come out by former Prime Minister Turnbull of recent time?
Well, we responded to what was a spill that was called by Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, ultimately it was in the purview of then Prime Minister Turnbull to call a spill. He called a spill and we responded accordingly. From my perspective, under the Westminster system, when you do vote against a Prime Minister, like I did, then the appropriate thing to do is to tender your resignation, which is what I did. I don't resile from having made that decision. It was the appropriate decision to make. Unlike other colleagues who simply offered their resignation, I actually tendered my resignation. Then, of course, there was a spill, and the numbers tell their own story, Adam, and you've been in politics, so you know that very, very well. And there was a motion to spill the position, and that motion was carried 45 to 40. And then there was a ballot between Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, and Scott Morrison won that ballot 45 to 40. So there were 5 Morrison votes. that obviously voted for a spill, and then, of course, the party room made its decision. Now, the important thing is, of course, to move on, because what we don't want is we don't want another 6 years of fiscal vandalism as we had under Labor. And, of course, every day we are reminded as to the reasons why we don't want Bill Shorten and his team on the Treasury benches.
Well, you talk about whether or not people want Bill Shorten or not, and I mean, it only took a couple of weeks until there was a change in the polls for preferred Prime Minister, and I think most Australians were surprised to see Scott Morrison polling quite well as preferred PM against Bill Shorten. I think you'll see on your screen now a little bit of a graphic on the polling for that preferred Prime Minister. So I think there's certainly been some sort of a response in regards to the public. But today we've seen Bill Shorten announcing what could be called a 5-point plan leading into the unlosable election for Labor. The interesting thing about what I think what Bill Shorten's announced today, it's his battle lines of where the election will be fought. And I think Turnbull was really missing out on on many of those battle lines and what the key message was. How are you going to take it as a coalition up to Labor when Labor's polling so well? Bill Shorten's running a policy agenda. He's targeting families with early school education and so forth. What's going to be the response of the Liberals and the coalition?
Look, I think that the strength of the coalition has always been our national security basis and our economic security basis. And on both those fronts, we're very, very strong. On the national security front, I mean, let's not forget, last time Labor promised that they would push back boats, they would stop the boats, and then we saw, as soon as they got into power, the blowout in the situation with illegal maritime arrivals. And we're still dealing with that caseload, Adam, of that 50,000 who came in to Australia. And of course, economic security. Economic security is very important. It manifests itself very much in the day-to-day issues, jobs and job security. And let's not forget that every day we're seeing over 1,000 jobs being created in Australia's economy, and that means that's 1,000 more people that are earning. That's potentially 1,000 more families whose breadwinner is bringing home an income. And of course, that in turn has generated less people, more revenue for the government, but it's also generated less people now needing to rely on our social security system. So it really is very much a win-win for our economy, and most especially we're seeing that in our small business sectors.
Okay. Senator, can I move on to another issue which came about last year, and that was the same-sex marriage vote. I know that you were one of the senators who were in the coalition who voted against that. Now, I've had a look at the data. There were just under 16 million Australians that were eligible to vote. Just under 8 million voted yes, and just under 5 million voted no. But interestingly, more than 20% of those that were eligible to vote didn't vote. So, from my accounts, less than 49% of Australians who could have voted voted yes. And we know that many of those electorates that did vote no, there are a dozen or so, they were Labor electorates. What do you think that this will mean, and how will this be targeted, this vote, in a federal election? Or is that done and dusted? That was last year's vote, Australia's changed?
Look, Adam, 2 points on that. One is that you're absolutely correct, those statistics, and they were the very statistics that I used in my speech in the Senate in relation to this legislation and the reason why I voted no. 8 of those 10 electorates are actually in New South Wales, and they're very much the seats, some of which I've been patron senator for a long, long time. Back in 2015, I gave a speech to the National Press Club in which I said that in an ageing, culturally diverse and religiously diverse Australia, there was a portion of the population that would vote no, and that's very much been delivered in these seats, which are very much seats that have culturally diverse and religiously diverse populations. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that for many people who actually did vote yes, they did so on the understanding that religious freedoms would be protected. And so whilst I welcomed the establishment of the Ruddock Committee to look at religious freedoms. Regrettably, we haven't seen the deliberations of that committee go public, and I think it's really incumbent, particularly on the Attorney-General now, to release that. I think there's a lot of people who do expect us to protect their religious freedoms, and certainly we had thousands and thousands of submissions to the Philip Ruddock Committee, and I certainly encouraged people to make submissions, and I've also written on various occasions to Philip Ruddock about this review. It's important. There has been disquiet about the way that review was conducted, and so that's why it's very important for that report to be released and released as soon as possible, so that Australians can see for themselves where the needs are and where religious freedoms have to be protected.
OK, well, what we might do during the week is follow up with the Attorney-General and find out what's going to happen with the timing of the release of that report. Senator, I appreciate you coming in on Sunday afternoon to have a chat with us on the return of the Adam Giles show. Your comments are noted. We'll now throw to a break.